Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Corey Thornton. I'm the Managing Editor for Market Intelligence at Open Minds. Today, as part of our weekly Executive Web Forum series, Open Minds Senior Associate Ray Wolfe will discuss collaboration as a strategic tactic using mergers, acquisitions, and affiliations to achieve your strategic objectives. Mr. Wolfe has over 40 years of experience, including expertise in managed care, value-based reimbursement models, financial analysis, and strategic planning. Before we get started, we have a couple of housekeeping reminders. Your audio will be muted during today's briefing, but we also rely on your questions and comments via the question box on the right side of your screen. You can send in your questions throughout the briefing and Mr. Wolfe will answer them. The slides and recording from today's briefing will be available on the Open Minds website by tomorrow. And with that, Ray Wolfe.
Thank you, Corey. I certainly appreciate all your help. This presentation for me feels a little awkward. It's difficult for me to work through my feelings right now about mergers and acquisitions. I started when I first worked at Pittsburgh Mercy in an atmosphere where I felt that even at $100 million or $80 million in size, we were too small, and that we needed to be merging quickly with anybody, anywhere. And during that time, it was kind of the period when many of us would be looking for mergers and aggressively trying to find them. And others in the same community of providers would have no interest at all. The end result was a lot of what I think were very one-sided mergers where persons of very little size, strength, or leverage were able to obtain much better deals than potentially was appropriate. Nonetheless, I still think merger and acquisition is absolutely critical. In fact, I think it's more so than ever before. But the way we approach it now has to be different, has to be more structured, has to be more defined, and to follow a process path that is a little clearer. So what I've tried to do with this presentation is build why and the hows and the wheres of a good process, a high-level view of that process, moving us from where we are to a better place that is strategically and operationally superior to where we are. During the course of that, then, I want to look at largely these 5 areas. One, the why, the disruption we now face and why it's a buyer's market rather than the old seller's market that we once saw in terms of merger and acquisition. 2, and I think this becomes a critical element, learning to build from the ground up with strategic thinking as the very beginning of the process that we have in the merger and acquisition activities and projects we would have. 3, how do you evaluate an appropriate target so that time and effort is not spent on something that will not yield you the benefit you need? Goodness knows in this day and age, we can't afford to be wasting administrative time on efforts that don't work. 4, I'm noticing a big change in the way we are developing structured legal networks to support merger and acquisition. And I want to talk, rely a little bit on my 50-year-old law degree to some extent to talk about how these networks and these options are being created and to give you a sense of the amount of innovation and creativity that is available in each of those. And finally, I have seen many merger projects in our field where the final decision was made, the papers were signed, and it was declared over when in fact it was not. So with that groundwork, I'd like to begin talking first about the why and then walking through 4 steps that will largely define how the merger and acquisition projects should flow in an atmosphere that's a little more disruptive, a little more dangerous, a little more chaotic than anything we've ever sensed. Anyone who tells you they understand COVID at this point, or they know where the future is going to lead, is probably inaccurate, to say it politely. The best strategic thinkers are responding with the words, I don't know. So in that, I think it was kind of important that we kind of look at what we do know and the impacts that we will face, and also look at what may affect us going forward that we don't presently see. One, we know that the pandemic intersects and compounds ongoing trends. The pandemic didn't create the need for more technology in our system, but it certainly accelerated. It didn't create value-based reimbursement, but it certainly over the next several years is going to push alternative payment systems, of which value-based will be one, into that correct direction. We know that communities of color and the marginalized are the most impacted, and therefore the people we serve have had the most negative trauma resulting from this as anyone in the United States. And we, as providers of service to them, are likewise traumatized. 3, there is no known end yet. The crises will vary by region and may not end with a vaccine announcement or actually even a vaccine in use. We'll see waves of it move across geographic areas of the country, and we'll see some potential interplay between flu season and pandemic, the COVID pandemic, that may not be very positive for us at all. The end result of all of that is that the need for nonprofit services is going to absolutely explode. And that as a result of that, we are going to be taxed in every effort we make to deal with the problem and to try to address and heal the people in our community. And many of us will close the doors as a result. That much, I believe, is known and solid. I don't know, and I'm not sure anyone does, the length and severity of the economic downturn or how long it will take to return, nor do we know the length and severity of the actual pandemic itself. We know that our healthcare safety net has been resilient to this point, but we're starting to see a number of hospital failures and hospital mergers and acquisitions. And that's an area where I had thought that almost all mergers and acquisitions had already occurred. We were down to under 1,000, down to under 700 major hospital systems in this country. And even at that, we're starting to see additional failures. We don't know at this point the aggressiveness of the government response, the level of mandatory technology integration that will happen within our service models. And by mandatory, I don't necessarily mean mandated by regulation, but certainly mandated by an effort to keep many of our programs financially viable. What concerns me the most about what we don't know is number 6 and 7 on this slide. What is the level of social cohesion? Are we going to continue to move apart as a country to become divided camps? Is our nation headed for a continuous culture war? Or is there some opportunity to return to a middle ground and build a culture that over time begins to heal some of the wounds and return to what was a period of time that I remember as I was younger of heated but rational and thoughtful debate? And what are the scale of the aftershocks? Are we going to be hit with a second wave? Even if we're not, are we going to be hit with a second wave or an aftershock of PTSD resulting from problems with kids in schools or parents or families who have been through significant and serious loss? What is the impact of isolation on issues of substance use and abuse? How will these things begin to impact our system? How will the healthcare system be impacted by the number of persons who are not getting preventive care? And as a result of that, we'll be faced with problems down the road that'll be more significant and substantial than before. We are far from the end of the aftershocks that we will face in this process. The negative financial trends will accelerate and continue. State budget crises, reductions in the number of people who have insurance, with potential difficulties in Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act exacerbating that problem. How will funds be redirected in state budgets and federal budgets, knowing that every time I've seen states respond, they respond to physical health issues first. I believe that the acceleration will happen with value-based reimbursement, and that will move us quickly towards that kind of environment. And it's an environment that is so much higher risk to the actual provider. And are we ready in any shape to take that? I know several foundations in Pittsburgh, and I believe this is kind of a national trend, that build annual budgets based on the interest they receive, so that their foundation monies, their basic core structure, remains approximately the same size. If the foundations stay in that model, there will be almost nothing, because interest rates have fallen to near zero, and their ability to help will be substantially impacted. Now, I believe there is a great deal of talk in the foundation community about really making this a high expenditure, get into your principal and build the community sort of time, but we don't know that will be the case. And in the midst of all of that, our productivity-based reimbursement systems are going to be taxed, because it's just going to be tougher and tougher to gain access to our systems. At the same time all this is happening, the money out segments will increase as well. I think you can see in that regard the elements I've listed and the needs for growing technology, the pressures we're going to feel even with high unemployment around salary. Those kind of features are going to begin to push and occur regularly. So the end result is a lot of people are now looking at mergers and acquisitions, people who never did before, people who were resistant to the idea when we first discussed it. Providers are now out there, having weathered what they believe to be the first wave of a continuing storm of financial difficulties, and wondering whether they can make it alone. So now there are numerous people in the market looking for mergers and opportunities to find linkages that will make them safer and sounder as we face the challenges ahead together. But we aren't of the same strength we once were. And as a result of that, there are possibilities out there for merger and acquisition activity or collaborative activity that could be very dangerous to our own survival as well as to that of others. So it is within this environment that I think we are seeing that dangers really exist. I went back and looked, and I created a couple that I thought were kind of interesting to look at because they were so prevalent for what we may face in this new environment. The old bankruptcy case of New York Central and Pennsylvania Railroad, two cash poor entities that with great ego and status debated for a long time about how to merge, but two cash poor entities don't create a wealthy one. And within a week of the final decision and the final signing of paperwork, both of them failed and went into bankruptcy. We face many possibilities where potential mergers could put us at financial weaknesses. And I think that's one that I want to highlight as an example of that problem, even when faced with the best businessmen in the country at the time. Quaker Oats and Snapple. The management team of both of those products did not have the capacity or skill set to run the business. They were both too lean. They made decisions to eliminate administration too inappropriately, and in the resulting merger, they didn't have the capability to grow their products correctly. In the end, the merger was dissolved by both boards, and Snapple was sold by Quaker Oats at a significant loss. But the idea that we can do more, or that somehow administration can take the full brunt of the savings that may be needed to bring us back to financial capability, is one that creates a danger. And I wanted to point this failure out as a result of that. Sprint and Nextel, I think, are ideas, are items out there also that point to a different way that acquisitions and collaborations have to occur. The Nextel system was very, very hierarchical in approach, and Sprint was very innovative and almost googly in the way they managed, and the culture clashes really came to paralyze the company. The difficulties that occurred, the lack of pre-definition about who would have what roles at lower than the executive level, created a system that, again, had to come apart. So I point these out because I think there are three high-level dangers that will exist in our new environment and that we're going to have to face as we look ahead. In the end, I think it boils down to better discernment in three areas. We should be clear about the benefits. We should understand more definitely what we expect to gain, and we should execute and commit to the board to do that in a way that those benefits are attained. We've had far too many mergers in our industries where what we've seen is the inability of the folks to really accurately describe that. They talk about cost savings, they merge, but there are no cost savings. And that is not an acceptable pattern for the kind of financial environment we're in. What is the vision now? In an atmosphere where we don't know what the future looks like, where state control is probably going to be less as the result of bringing in more insurance carriers, as nonprofits fail in other areas, is it really viable to think of community mental health or IDD as standalone systems anymore? And if so, what should replace them? And how should we build that vision? And finally, if we do have a vision and we do understand what the benefits might be, just simply, who's a quality target? How do we know we're not making a mistake in what we do going forward? Corey, do we have any questions at this point I could respond to?
We do, Ray. We have one came in and it's short and to the point. Are some provider organizations too small to collaborate?
Yes. Right now, I think the urgency of becoming bigger and building based on a vision to where we need to be mean that we cannot waste our time on organizations who will not provide us substantial benefits. In fact, organizations below a certain size should be merging among themselves simply to create an entity big enough to attract a larger provider. If I were in the market that I believe many of those on this call are, of mid to large size organizations, I would certainly have a threshold amount under which I would not waste my time. In the end, as we know, so many entities are going to fail. That's going to be a place where we can pick up services without going through the effort. That sounded harsh, and most people who know me know that I love to approach this industry from a mission basis rather than pure business. But I think at this point in time, we have to be concerned about our own missions. And I think that for many of us out there, building that baseline that we simply aren't going to look below this level, or encouraging people below a certain level to organize among themselves in a way that makes them more acceptable, is largely correct. But I think below a certain level, it's a two-step process. You will have to create yourself to a certain size, and that size then will make you appealing to a larger entity, and it's going to take your time. So the urgency for those folks, I think, is even heavier at this point. Thanks, Corey. So what are the benefits? And I went through the processes of saying, all right, Let's build a plan about what it is that we want to get. What kind of benefits can we get from a merger acquisition sort of strategy or objective? And I think there are these 5 that really stand out to me as possibilities for us that would benefit us in the kind of market we have today. One is simply economies of scale. This is the one everyone knows. No sense really reiterating that too much. The second one that is often forgotten and missed is growth and capabilities. Is there a provider out there that's really doing very, very well with their electronic health record? Is there a provider out there that has a finance director that everyone really envies? Are there people out there with foundational capabilities that are substantial, that have really high-end clinical products? What can we do to improve the overall structure of our entity by looking at those soft things that don't quantify easily, but that would be substantial improvements in where we are? For those of you perhaps in the IDD industry who are thinking about both collaborations and mergers as well as EHR capability, doesn't that suggest a path that you might want to begin to look in your target search structure? I think more and more importantly, we're going to be relying on synergies of service as well. Cross-referral patterns, enhancements of revenue. How many services can a single person using a single entry point to the organization really generate? Can we be comprehensive about what we do to them? Can we provide services they need that traditionally haven't been supplied through our organization? One of the biggest sources for referral in a good organization of a decent size with a comprehensive service line is simply cross-referral, the movement of folks between different levels of service and different types of service to enhance the product that we give them. We can also begin to look, and I think this is becoming more important, about diversification in the marketplace. We are single market providers. We are specialists. We deal with unique services to a unique population. When you look at that, that's not very well favored in a value-based reimbursement environment. Those are environments where team-based care providing lots of services and multiple contacts to a person are far more favored. Is it possible we should diversify as a result of that into additional marketplaces? Should we be looking, for example, at moving into more integrated work with the homeless and primary care providers, or structured approaches to entering into the elder care and frail elderly market, potentially even working with the VA and others to create social determinant markets for veterans and those with PTSD? Finally, there's one that I think is kind of new to me, but I think it's really important to talk about, and that's just eliminating competition from the marketplace. When you look at national payers and you look at big folks moving in, they really like environments where there are multiple providers who do not have large market shares. They can move into that marketplace and very quickly attract a number of people away. They can very quickly see the failures of some of their competition, which will leave large additional groups of persons ready to move in. And they are actually hesitant about marketplaces where a big percentage of the market share is managed by a single relatively strong entity. As a result, I think simply protecting yourself from entry into your marketplace by the disruptors, which would to me include both hospital systems as well as the retail giants that are presently so focused on our marketplace, or the insurance carriers who are becoming payviders of services as they develop. What do the visions look like? And I think there were 5 ways to build your vision, and these are not mutually exclusive, but think about these 5 acquisition, collaboration, merger types as ways to think about the future of your company. Do you want to be the region's largest and best provider at a single service? Then a horizontal merger of you with direct competitors provides that capability to move ahead. This has been the most common marking that we've had as we've seen the landscape change, but it's not by a long stretch the only one. We can look at vertical integrations that provide more integrated care. So we can talk about providing whole person care. We can talk about providing the best care for the individual we serve, focusing on a specific individual. Vertical mergers, vertical collaborations of type really work well in an environment that's shifting towards alternative payment systems, because providers that can provide these kind of multiple service groupings can take the best advantage of VBR style contracts and potentially yield the best results for the people served. Market extension is simply how big do you want to be? Do you want to diversify, not by looking at growing in your region, but by growing in states that may be close so that you can work with across borders? This provides you some level of diversification and projection against state budget crunches, which will be substantial. The likelihood is that two states will not look at the same type of cut in the same amount in certain service areas. So you will be protected in some vein by becoming more of a regional and a national presence in what you do. The product extension is an interesting one because it pushes us back to a day when multiple organizations were really non-existent, that specialty groupings didn't have any substance at all. They were just fantasies. And what we had was settlement houses. And those settlement houses were open doors to the community for whatever needs they had. They operated as first generation care management and care coordination entities that just kind of linked those who were elderly with those who had mental illness, with those with disabilities, those with intellectual disabilities, as well as physical disabilities, those with issues of systemic hunger or homelessness, and responded to all those needs. There's a good argument that the return to the settlement house might be the next generation of why we approach nonprofit care, and that a settlement house kind of approach matched with the correct kind of technology could build a pretty massive system in those areas. And finally, there's the conglomerate. Can we do other things at a profit that would allow us to spend more money in various ways for the people we serve? Are there other kinds of entities out there on a for-profit basis that can do this work? Nonprofits can merge with and collaborate with, structure with all kinds of for-profit entities without endangering their status, so long as those entities remain a reasonably small portion of their total. But even though they might be a reasonably small version, they would not necessarily be a reasonably small percentage of the total profit. Using these visions or comprehensive groups of these visions, we need to find ways to begin to look to build a consensus opinion among our key stakeholders and our staff about what we need to be, and we shouldn't leave that meeting until we had reached the point of a very clear value proposition that we can state with consistency and clarity. We need to be able to, at the end of this visioning process, bring everyone on board, work through the differences and use them to enhance the role that we define, and look at a potential use of 1, 2, even 3 of those 5 models in ways that would push our organization forward. The end result of that, to me, is the need for clarity and consistency on the other end. The issue is having everyone on board. And I think that in the groundwork stages, that becomes a critical element. Are there any concerns about the groundwork? Corey, any questions?
Yes, Ray, thank you. We have one came in. How realistic is it to consider product extensions or models to integrate to serve different populations?
Very. It is probably the most discussed, the most energy among the groups of people that I'm working with right now on M&A or collaborative activity. The idea that they have seen how badly mental health or IDD budgets can be impacted, and they understand that the dangers that exist with being completely tied to single payers or single systems of care. Right now, I'm seeing a lot of activity that's happening with understanding and appreciation on both ends of its importance. And I'm seeing it with elder care. I'm seeing it with FQHCs and integration into physical health and homeless activity. I'm seeing it with work with veterans groups. I'm seeing it with work with children's groups and foster care, and in bringing all of those together into a single system. I know, for example, in West Virginia, it's really inappropriate to look at the southern portion of my state where we have been so ravaged by the opioid problems, where we have grandparents raising young children because of the death of the parent. And to look at that and not think a comprehensive approach is better. How do you deal with the issues of substance abuse, child care, foster care and support for a grandparent, the trauma and the difficulties and adjustment disorders that could well result with the child, and deal with all of that in a single entity that is sustained solely by the Office of Mental Health Services? It's not possible. And I think as you look at that environment and try to think through it, that we may be going through in the future, many of you may see a future for that kind of activity that is really important. Whether these happen, whether they come off, I can't guarantee you. I can just say that right now, there's an enormous amount of energy around that, and a lot of folks are beginning to see that same vision. Thank you for that one. So who's a quality target? Now have a vision in place. You know what it is you want to be. What do you look for in a target that isn't going to be a poison pill that you're going to swallow? I listed again 7 possibilities, but I think in these you're going to see some that may be fairly common to you. Cultural compatibility is always mentioned and discussed. I'm not sure whether we do work around cultural compatibility or just relationship compatibility between executive teams. In either regard, whatever we're looking at in that regard is a key element. But to me, the most important one at this point is, what is the financial status of the people we're looking at? I know I've done a lot of work and really am invested in the idea of this multifaceted financial assessment model. But when I look at that and I think about its use in mergers and acquisitions, I'm really kind of impressed. We should know before we start, and we can know because of the availability of financial information, both from our states and from GuideStar and the 990 process. We can see very clearly what financial structures are. One of the big bumps you will very early hit is comparative salary structures. Why are they making more than I am, doing the same level of work at the same place? What can be done to bring those structures into balance? Those become key elements for a discussion. And if the salary structures are too off kilter, the likelihood is that you're going to be investing more time and energy and resources in a merger that's not going to generate good energy from the staff. How do networks, payers, stakeholders view the target you're looking at? Do they have a quality reputation? Because in fact, you're buying their reputation. So are they accredited? Do you look at Facebook and social media and see a lot of negatives? Is there substantial problems that you hear grassroots in your community? All of that, really, though it is not scientific, has a place to be considered. And it flows into the idea of brand strength and looking at people in that regard. One of the key things we're all going to have to do moving forward is promote innovation. So someone that is more resistant to the idea of the merger is probably someone you may not want, because they're not going to be innovative on the far end of the merger as you need to create the new programming that you have to have going forward. Finally, do you feel a strong commitment to the idea of executing? Will these people be as strong about getting things done on the far end as you are at this point in developing it? We'll underline the financial element. And I think that becomes key as we look forward. I would have metrics in place that simply did not allow for that kind of process to go forward if financial metrics were not positive. In fact, I would be looking for a decision process map before we ever begin. We want to know that this entity is financially and legally sound, and we can investigate enough that we don't have to get into due diligence to know necessarily that this shouldn't occur. Can you articulate from your vision how this target might align with that vision? Cultural compatibility, I'll throw in, payer reputation, physical access, the kind of things we saw on the prior page, but create in them a structure with key threshold points, quantifiably defined, and don't break from it. There's a tendency when you become focused on developing a merger to think about the great possibilities on the other end and to become committed to the merger long before you've done the correct due diligence and observation. Because of that, I'm becoming more and more convinced that some kind of decision process tree that says, do they have more than 2 employee labor relations actions in the last year? Do they have a current ratio that's at least 2.0? What's their leverage mark? And to have those written out and to just stop dead and to take them from the target list when those are not met. I think that becomes a little bit critical in course of this development. And I really think that we ought to understand that our tendency is going to be to go too far with someone we know, with the relationship we like, to trust ourselves. And building these decision trees will probably be important to us as we move forward. I want to talk just a second about how do you make that first contact? What's an appropriate way to deal with it? And I don't think that most people understand the importance of the professionalism and the feel of that first contact. I believe you need a pitch deck. I believe that pitch deck has to be looked at a very high professional level. The pages need to show your colors beautifully and your logos and to be laid out in a way that makes marketing sense. Very quickly, it ought to move through no more than 10, 11, 12 pages with very, very little language and lots of bullets that talk about your organizational strengths, the problems that you see arising in your community and your vision for addressing that problem, and then ought to flow very quickly into a very quick conversation about what we would see as the benefit of the two of us working together. It should contain this material. It should end with an ask. Do you, in fact, want to consider this in terms of the process flow that you might see going forward? The approach to the target ought to be CEO to CEO in the beginning. You shouldn't have board members present. It should be based on the privacy of that relationship. Take that professional looking pitch deck and don't ask for approval from the other person. Ask simply that the idea be presented and that the boards be allowed to meet together. The best outcome is a follow-up meeting with key board members and confidentiality. Frankly, Pittsburgh area and where I've seen. The A-level outcome is 4 or 5 board members from each end and a couple CEOs and a couple CFOs gathered around a table. And the A+ is if in fact there is a meal available at the same time. Something about that just relaxes folks into a process more quickly. At least it always has for me. The importance of the pitch deck as you leave this meeting is simply to leave it behind, perhaps with multiple copies. If this works well, that initial grouping of them will be out there in terms of moving with the board members and provide them ways to look back and think through it as you move forward. This is a place where your articulation of vision becomes critically important in engaging someone else in the process of the merger. As you move into discussions, do not be afraid of facing problems early. Don't make that initial board review a place where you are just doing glib introductions and discussions of families, but really clearly use it to articulate your goal. Don't be afraid of putting issues into a parking lot for discussion later, but do be afraid of not articulating all the issues that may be out there. Be involved in what I think of as a due diligence process that is effective and begins from day one. And incomplete due diligence becomes a key to the problems of it. Looking at the landscape with a tunnel vision, you know, community mental health centers have always existed. We're going to exist together. We have a 120-year history, therefore we probably get a 240-year history. Those aren't ways to approach these issues anymore. Don't be driven by fear, be driven by hope. And in that, I mean, be able to articulate that vision at every point you meet a problem and talk and brainstorm together will create the best environment for a future activity. Clearly at this place, I think that the board get together becomes a 2 to 3 hour meeting of friendly and open conversation that may be a little bit ego driven at times, but largely is going to explore what the problems might be, what the red flags are, what the drop dead points would be for any provider in terms of not wanting to cross certain levels. And it's okay to come back to everything later, but it's not okay at this point to leave those things unsaid. Any discussion about targets, Corey? Is there a question out there we should respond to at this point?
Yes, there is, Ray. And it is, can due diligence be done less expensively by limiting the legal or financial involvement by external parties? To short, do we really need accountants and lawyers to do the due diligence work?
I think it depends on the level of risk that you would be willing to manage. For medium-sized organizations, I would say do not be afraid of the cost of a good legal due diligence process managed by a third-party lawyer and a good accounting due diligence process managed by a good CPA. Those provide information you might not get or might not know correctly. As a result of that, I think that the risk, the potential downside risk is more than the expense you would have. But because those activities are so potentially budget breaking or expensive in the flow, there's a couple things I would have to consider doing. First, I would consider very, very heavily the idea of both of us agreeing on a single accountant or a single lawyer to work with both entities and thereby divide the costs equally. Secondly, I would consider doing more and more work individually up front. You can know a lot about the financial structure of another entity before due diligence begins. You can know an awful lot about the legal issues they face or the relationships with employees before you ever get into due diligence. So I would say be careful. Don't be afraid to end due diligence early. But for me, in a more conservative approach, I definitely would spend the money to make sure it was done correct. Thank you. Finally, mergers and acquisitions is a word that encompasses a million different legal structures that do everything from no governance change at all the way to incredibly collaborative corporate structures. In this process, I think it is really important to understand that it is not a one-size-fits-all structure. You may have a very good idea for a holding company that works very well, and then come across an opportunity with a smaller provider that really makes more sense as a full merger, or then have a relationship with an FQHC that is so complicated by the regulations they have that collaborative contracts and joint ventures tend to work. So all of these are tools for the toolbox. They are not one size fits all, and they are not one type per company. So in that regard, let me give you a quick look at what I'm seeing. One, with the collaborative relationships, it's pretty clear that joint ventures and other elements are simply contracts, and that you can walk away from them at each point, and the legal entity that you refer to, the board that you refer to, the articles of incorporation, your tax exempt status are totally unaffected. Merger and acquisition, in its most technical definition, is exactly the opposite of that. Merger and acquisition is a structure that will radically change who you are. In a true merger, party one and party two go in, and a new entity is created and comes out the other side. That is more critical than it may sound, because party one and party two have a long history of contracts and obligations, licensures for their facilities, verifications of staff and accreditations of physicians and therapists and social workers. They have leases and structures for facilities. And all of those disappear because party one and party two are no longer there. Everything has to be rebuilt from scratch within that new entity. Most importantly, every revenue generating bill system, every licensure that goes behind that, every fire inspection that's the basis of that licensure that gives you the right to do the billing has to be rebuilt from scratch because you are a new company. Slightly less onerous is the acquisition, where entity two simply joins into entity one, and entity two disappears, but entity one simply becomes bigger and has to pick up some work for relicensure, restructuring of contracts, redevelopment of staff accreditations. Acquisition is, I think, particularly valuable when entity one and entity two are a very, very different size. If entity one is larger and has a more comprehensive administration program, entity two is facing the fact and realization that its size no longer allows it to be an effective mission-oriented organization in the community, then I think that it makes sense for the acquisition process to work. Membership substitution is a model that I think is probably the most common, where one entity becomes a sponsor and another becomes a secondary. Both entities become related, but both entities continue to have their licenses, their board, their CEO, all of their regulatory structures stay in place, all of their contracts stay in place, and this new related grouping of two, this new binary in some ways can work together to determine how fast those models should come together, or even if they should at all come together. Most of these sponsoring entities, which are usually the larger, will have some kind of control over the secondary, like ratification of budget or ratification of major expenditures, perhaps some control in who becomes a board member in the secondary body. But other than that, day to day, board meeting to board meeting, the secondary entity operates relatively independent and can continue to do so, even though it can rely on this joint strength. The holding company model is similar, except both entity 1 and entity 2 come together to create it. So while this holding company might be a new entity that on paper has control of entity 1 and entity 2 and has some authority to manage their budgets, their administration, and to contract for them, in truth, you can structure the holding company so that board members from entity 1 and entity 2 comprise the holding company itself. Even CEOs and CFOs of those entities can be given permanent places on the holding company board. So in fact, you don't have that kind of hierarchy. You have more of a blend. Holding companies are really good when you want to build a single administration or have a single entity that might be able, without fear of antitrust, to negotiate contracts for a bigger grouping of structure. The key to both the membership substitution and the holding company is the difference between reserved and delegated powers. All of the entities right now that exist have powers that they have completely to themselves. They can decide anything they want. They can move largely in any direction they want, as long as they stay within the general laws of the state that they work in. When they come together to create a new entity or create a new structure, the entity that has the reserved powers can decide how much to delegate upward and how much to retain. So the idea of being very creative about your reserve powers is a critically important factor. Do you want to hold on to your foundation? Do you want to keep your golf tournament? Do you want to have full access to certain benefits that have been provided to you by time, by donors? And what is it that that is of particular and unique importance to you that you do not want shared? And you have every right going into the negotiations to withhold that. Delegated powers are those that the new entity gets in its entirety. What becomes the difficult area is this idea of shared powers. Shared powers are those things you do together, and there ought to be a map for every one of those. When you have a budget, who originates that budget? Is it the executive team of the smaller entity? If so, do they need to be consulting with the executive team of any other entity? Does their board have the decision-making capability? And by deciding, I mean, do they have the ability not only to approve it and ratify it, but the ability to change it or to send it back for further work or to insert things and have the power to grow it and adapt it in critical ways? Should the new entity that's been created, the holding company or the new sponsor entity, should that have the power to approve that budget? If so, should they have decision-making powers, or should they just be allowed to ratify? Should they be given just the right to say yes or no with respect to it? There are about 15 or 20 that we can matrix out in an appropriate way to say, looking at these, who should have the power, each of the powers to do this. But frankly, it's one of the most difficult things to do in a newly merged entity is to decide what the appropriate flow is. So getting reserved, delegated, and a good mapping of the shared powers together before the merger is absolutely critical. Other concerns at this point, Corey?
Yes, Ray, we have another question came in. What does a process map look like for shared power?
It can look like, for those of you who are in love with Excel spreadsheets, a series of Excel spreadsheet pieces where questions are listed down one side. How do you deal with new members of the board? How do you deal with budget approval? How do you deal with the replacement of a CFO or a C-level person? How do you deal with the replacement of a CEO? How do you make decisions about signing a contract of over a certain dollar amount? and just list out those questions along the rows, listing each party across the top in each column, and then deciding whether it's no involvement whatsoever, a consultation involvement, an involvement that is actually the originator, the developer, the person who's supposed to put together the project timelines and the project deliverables in such a way that it can be reviewed, which board should decide or ratify and which other board should decide or ratify. Once you get the feel for the flow of filling in the squares created by all the columns matrixed against all the rows, you can get a good sense of a really major agreement coming out of that about how your organization should work. And it's perfectly valid to say in certain of those, I don't think that this entity should have any say in that process. So I think if you are really looking for a future together, things like budget approval, strategy approval, and probably purchases of over a certain size, say $1 million or $2 million, really should be reflected throughout the thinking of both entities, or at least the subsidiary entity with the holding company or with the sponsor. It's a reasonable activity. There are good spreadsheets out there that I think do that, but just in that layout, I think that makes some sense. Thank you. Bottom line, it's all about execution. The real power of combined entity lies in 4 or 5 areas: technology, market strength, integration, corporate efficiency, and innovation. Those should be the key marks of what you do when you execute this, which begins well before the final signatures, but extends well past them. This kind of activity, I think, really creates a focus on value, and value becomes the most important element in my mind of building a common culture. Focus on building good KPI. Good KPI to me have 4 characteristics that you should measure in terms of the success you are promising your board for this particular entity. First of all, what do you want to influence? Do you want to improve revenue? Do you want to reduce expenses? Do you want to make employees happier? Do you want to increase the number of customers or the number of customers who are cross-referring? Define that effect. Is it retention? Is it a dollar amount for revenue and expenses? Is it increases in intake? Give some key decisions there to what is that impact, and then define what the norm would be for success. Is it a 10% increase? Is it a 20% improvement? What are you looking at as that key? Defining exactly how you propose to get it from this new entity, because these things are not going to happen automatically simply because they came together and changed the color of a logo. In all of this, be sure you have the capability to track that data and to move ahead correctly and to make these commitments publicly to your board, to your staff, and to your stakeholders as ways of seeing that process move ahead. Staff engagement is one of the most critical areas to address, and you're going to have to answer the big question in everybody's mind, which is, what's in it for me? Am I safer as a result of this action or not? What will thrill me about this? Do I have more chance for improvement? Or if I'm a part-time worker, do I have new places where I can get apply for potential contract shifts that might be helpful? Do we have right now the skill sets we need to get where we need to be, and how can I contribute to that? Do the leadership teams of both entities seem really involved in what I'm thinking? And can I trust them to be fair? Look at your staff with respect to these 5 questions, which have been really well defined by some good HR groups in the field. And I think they get to the what's in it for me challenge that you're going to face when you deal with 2 staffs who are going to be suddenly surprised as confidentiality drifts aside with what has occurred. What is a cultural commitment? What is the sense of cultural compatibility that we talked about? Frankly, I think it's a little less important than people give it credit for, if in fact we can live by the 3 laws of success. And that is that we create more value together. We've created an atmosphere where management is collaborative. If I can see, and do we share the value appropriately? If I can see a place where there's more money for pay raises, or benefits have improved, or the service that I'm giving to people I care about is actually better because of more doctors or more additional services, then I'm going to be happier. I'm going to be very pleased if I see the 2 management teams working together in effective ways, and that I see friendships developing, because I know that if conflicts develop, there's going to be a mutual effort to work it out. And if I can see that my entity, even if it's the smaller one, is getting a fair share of the increases of these things, I will be happy. So you can focus excessively on the ideas of cultural commitment, but they, to me, are kind of built by these 3 laws that frankly have been used by some other management consultants in the field for quite a long time. So that completes our presentation today. I want to thank Corey and Mina and the staff at Open Minds for keeping this connection in place during the course of this entire time, and I really appreciate your attention. Please feel free to contact me directly at Open Minds. I'd love to answer some emails about your specific issues, because I think this is so critical for us at this point to build into our strategies going forward. Thanks all of you very much.
Thanks, Ray, and I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I want to remind everyone that the slides and recording for this will be available tomorrow, and that we be back next week on Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern for the web forum Innovating for Sustainability, Best Practices for Finding and Launching New Service Lines. You can sign up for that at www.openminds.com. It is listed as webinars under the events tab. With that, thank you again, and thank you, Ray.
Thank you.